At this time, it's my pleasure to welcome our next featured speaker for our first afternoon learning block. And this is a really, really exciting opportunity, I think, for all of us to hear from Scott Milam. Scott is someone who I've known for a long time. As many teachers will know, you have people that you come across who you teach alongside, and they really inspire you. And Scott is one of those people who I've had the pleasure to teach alongside and who has really inspired me. So Scott Milam teaches chemistry and IB Chemistry HL at Plymouth High School in Canton, Michigan. He leads workshops and modeling instruction through the American Modeling Teachers Association. He designs learning activities for Pivot Interactives and serves as an advisor for the Black Student Union at his school. He also runs a really active and prominent YouTube channel. So I think it's safe to say that we could call Scott a YouTuber. And he's working towards publishing his second book right now. He was the 2017 Michigan Science Teacher of the Year and a finalist for the Presidential Award for Excellence in Mathematics and Science Teaching this past year. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to the Teacher Wellness Summit to Scott Milam.
All right. Thanks, Gary. Yes. Hello, everyone. I am Scott. I'm not as good as that made me sound, but I hope that I can give you guys some good help and tips today. Will you do me a favor if you are watching? Will you post in the chat what your content area or level of teaching is that you're currently doing, just so I get a sense of who I'm talking to a little bit? First grade. This is intimidating for me now. Ooh, TOK. All right. All right. Well, welcome. I joined at lunch, so I was teaching this morning, and I actually get done teaching a little early because I have a part-time instructional coach gig on top of my teaching load. So I kind of have all of my classes blocked in the morning nicely. But let me go ahead and see if I can get everything set up here. And let's talk about some stuff about learning and cognitive science and all of the things. Let me start by doing this. And make sure I look good. Gary, will you give me the thumbs up or chime in that I'm about to get the
I will be happy to. We'll let you know. We can see some of your slides. I think you've got.
How are we looking there? Does that look good?
Most looks like you've got one in like a notification bar in the middle. Now it looks great.
All righty. Well, very cool. I'll go ahead and get rolling. So I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes here, and then I believe we're going to do some Q&A. So this is me down here. I like to use this picture because it's something that one of my students gave me. So I actually had one of my students from my first school where I taught in Lincoln Park made a picture of me, and then one of my students from last year actually made this one. I feel like it makes me look like the big friendly giant. So the chemistry version of that, at least. So this is me. Like Gary said, I do a bunch of stuff. I actually enjoy doing a bunch of stuff most of the time. This week has been a little rough, as I'm sure some of you have experienced at some point during this year. But these are some of my stats, and I'll talk about some of those things. This is a fun book. We're talking about it at lunch a little bit that I wrote, and I'm working on a completely different book right now. That's how to teach chemistry. There's a snapshot of my YouTube channel with my fun songs that I do and things like that. So the first thing I want to talk about today is what you do at work, because one of the things that we do in a wellness thing is give you advice for how to balance your work. But one thing that I want to make clear is that when you're at school, that's most of your time and most of what you do. And what happens there is a really big component of being able to kind of have longevity within the profession and being able to have joy at work. These are two books that I find very applicable to this. The first one is Flow, and Flow is kind of it's a cognitive science definition, but you're all familiar with this. It's when you're engaged in something so much that time goes by very quickly. And so the most common example in the book is for surgeons, that when a surgeon is doing surgery, that they're so engrossed with doing that process that an 8-hour surgery just seems to go by in a snap. And I'm sure that for teaching, that's also critical. I have found that in the last couple of years that I think a mistake that sometimes we make is that as we're struggling through pandemic teaching, sometimes we assume that we need less. And so we try and draw back what we're doing. And that's helpful. But there's also a missing component. And I hear this from teachers a lot when I do workshops, that we miss that joy that we used to get out of work. And so getting into a flow is not always going to happen when you reduce your workload. It's something different that we're seeking there. The second book here is Drive. This is by one of my favorite authors, Daniel Pink. And this is on what motivates people. And if you ask people what motivates people, especially within work settings, they often will say that money does. But the reality of when we look into it is that there are other components that are much, much more important. And so I think some of us are learning that lesson currently. We're like, what is it exactly that we value and want out of things? And the most important things tend to be things like autonomy, being able to be creative, social interactions, things like that. I think sometimes we even kind of look at administration and levels and feedback within that. There's frustrations from that. But a lot of those will stem towards inability to be autonomous, inability to be creative, and to do what we think is best. So I want to walk you through what I do in my job and talk about why I still love teaching, even though it's hard sometimes, but I really like it. So this is a typical rundown of my week. I do a thing called modeling instruction. I really love it. It works well for me. On our first day of the week, usually or first day of a new unit, we'll do some kind of science experiment. So on the left there, you see water having electricity run through it. And on the left glass thing, whatever that's called, I don't know the fancy term for it, but it's called a mini Hoffman apparatus, but I don't know what the test tube, I guess. You'll see hydrogen gas being produced. And on the right side, you'll see oxygen gas being produced. And we actually put fire in both to confirm what they are. And on the right, you see students' ideas of what must be happening there. And so this is actually a really interesting thing. This is about 3 months into the school year, but this is where we get students to go, this is how we know that the formula of water is H2O. And you can see in the students' drawings that they're pretty quick to pick up on that. They're familiar with that from other lessons. But we start off with some kind of phenomena, some kind of scientific thing. And then we start with, what does the student see when they see that? And interestingly, in this bottom whiteboard, we've actually got some really interesting ideas here from the student where they're showing the electrical current splitting the oxygen and the hydrogens apart, going to over here and going to over here. So from there, we get into a big circle and we look at our whiteboards. Now, I only had one video of a circle, so this is a different set of whiteboards, but that's me over there in the tie. I'm the only one wearing a tie, I believe, in this class. And we sit and we talk about what we saw, what observations we made, data we collected, all kinds of stuff like that. And you'll notice that the students are engaged, they're having fun, and they're being listened to. I'm hearing their thoughts and using that as kind of our focal point for our lesson. Then we move into using what we discussed. So the model doesn't mean like a physical model, it means an idea. And so we spend 2 days looking at something and developing our idea of what we saw. And then we look to use our idea. Can we deploy our model? And so we give the students a task, and this can be as simple as a worksheet, or it could be a new lab or something else. But we have them go through and use what we discussed. And then we go through and we check in and we say, did this work? And this one, if you're a chemistry teacher, you'll recognize that here we're developing the idea or evidence for diatomics. If you're not a chemistry teacher, you probably won't know what that is. But we use what we did on the previous couple of days to evaluate and do some synthesis of ideas and application of ideas. And then at the end, we try and reach a consensus. Here are the ideas that we are now familiar with after our instruction. Let's put them together. Let's compile our evidence. Let's do all of the things that we do. So in the top right here is a review poster assignment that I often have the students do. In the bottom left are the standards from that unit. So that was my unit 4 in a snapshot. And these are the things that I think that I've taught them. And these are the things that I'm going to test them on. From there, I do a thing called standards-based grading. So I'm actually going to grade them on all 7 of these, and they're allowed to do reassessments on them. And so then we do that again. We get a new unit, we learn a new idea. These are some of the later units in my teaching, and these are some of the earlier ones. And to me, this is something that I really love doing. So I love starting with the student ideas and not just with me. I like that challenge of getting students to really think and process what exactly is happening. So if you, I just saw a couple of chemistry, science, math teachers in the high school level, like you'll notice if you look at what some of the details that are involved in these. And I know I'm on Twitter, so I see teachers a lot of times will post stuff on Twitter. And I think some of us experienced teachers will be skeptical, we'll be like, is this actually good thinking or does it just look good? But when you look at the connections some of the students are making within these diagrams and within these explanations, they are very powerful. They're not just kind of superficial things that are artistic. They are deep chemical concepts that are emerging here. And so when I try to think about what do I do in a given day, week, month, year, my favorite things about teaching, this was my list. And I think you can see that I get a lot of autonomy and ability to be creative, in part because of the system of teaching I use, and in part of kind of the environment and culture within my school. And I really love chemistry. I think a lot of teachers, when you ask them why do they teach, they talk about the students. For me, I really love the content, and I think that's okay. That's kind of my connection to things. But for me, this chemistry, being able to get chemistry to make sense to a high school student, incorporates so many of these big things that are motivating to me and make me really want to come back and continue doing things. Obviously, working with good colleagues is critical and awesome. And I'm fortunate that I have really supportive and wonderful colleagues that we do a lot of reflection together. I also have gotten to the point where people like Gary and many other people that I get to talk to and network with online. For me, the healthy grading practices is something really important because when I do my grading, I feel like it helps me focus the students and emphasize learning. And when I talk to teachers currently, there's developed a lot of point grubbing, and it can really detract from the stuff that's up here. When you have students who are like, well, what do I need to get the A? What do I need to get the points? Do I need to turn this in? It just kind of diminishes the role of both their actions as a student and yours as a teacher. So one of the things that's interesting down here at the bottom is I put a little link about reflection, and I do quite a bit of reflection. I'm actually going to break out of my PowerPoint here if it will let me. So these are reflections, and I do these every single week. This year has been hard, so I'm just gonna be honest. If you peruse these as we go through, but one of the interesting things here is that I score myself. Uh-oh, looks like I lost my share screen. Let me come back here. But I score myself every week on all of the classes I teach and all of the stuff that I do. And interestingly, some of my worst feeling weeks are actually scored pretty decently. So I kind of track, and then at the end I set a set of goals. And at the next week, I review my goals and go, how many of these did I do? What good things did I do in my teaching this week? And try and go through and do some of those practices. All right, let me come back to my PowerPoint here. All right. I think that's it. So that's what I do within my classroom, but I also do a lot of stuff outside of my classroom. And I think that for teaching is very isolating if you don't get outside your classroom and connect with other people. These are some of the chemistry teachers that I network with. And this is us. We designed a t-shirt for ourselves. That's how cool we are. I also do a large amount of reading. I've started reading a lot in the last 4 or 5 years, and I've really loved it. And I feel like being a teaching is such a valuable thing to do when you couple it with reading, because you get to share what cool stuff you're finding out about and learning about with your students. And I also think that when you've taught for a long time, that being in the active process of learning can really help you understand how to teach and how to interact with your students better. So I think it's really critical to look at abilities to do things outside the classroom. Gary mentioned that I worked for Pivot Interactives. These are some of the experimental projects that I've designed that are super fun to do. They allow me to be creative with how I come up with stuff. For those who aren't familiar, I'm sorry, for Pivot Interactives, this is a online virtual lab experiment thing where we take high quality videos and then students can then actually measure stuff virtually. So during the pandemic, this of course had a huge spike in use, but we try and come up with lab experiments for kids to do. And the other thing I would tell you is that I'm in year 16 of teaching. I'm still changing things every year and sometimes every week. in what I do. And I was very successful early on in teaching. I lucked into having some fantastic mentors and some fantastic students and kind of support from administration. But even in my last 3 cohorts of IB students, you can see that I'm still learning how to add things and to get better. The cognitive science stuff that I'm about to talk about, this was stuff that I started learning about 2-3 years ago tops. And it increased the learning that happened in my classroom. And it makes me feel better about what I do. So let's talk about that a little bit. So as a teacher, it is very critical that you understand how learning works, how the brain works, because that's really a huge chunk of what we do. And that can include multiple things. So absent from this particular diagram here is emotion. And I know you talked about a lot about well-being today. And that's actually embedded in here. It's just kind of hidden a little bit. So the way learning starts is you first have to sense something. And interestingly, most of the information that you sense, your brain is designed to immediately dump. So for instance, when you have been on the Zoom today, you've probably seen other people's faces and maybe even a little bit of their background or their clothing. And if you think and try and remember some of the things you saw, you might have an interesting, maybe you remember a certain thing that was unique or struck your memory as something. But most of the information you just immediately forgot. Like you can see me right now and you can see my color of shirt. But if you were to think back of any other person that you remember the color of their shirt of, you probably don't remember many. Now, the thing to note is that you're always taking in information. So if you kind of look beyond your computer screen for a second, I see all kinds of stuff around me. I'm always seeing all of that stuff and it's always being sensed by my brain. But unless something takes place that catches my attention, then I'm not going to do anything with it and I'm going to forget about it. Now, if a bear walks by, now all of a sudden my attention is going to be grabbed because I was getting data, I was getting information from over that section, but until a bear walked into that part of my vision, I wasn't paying attention to over here. Once the bear walks by, now all of a sudden my short-term memory becomes engaged. And your short-term memory is something that only works for a little bit, so about 30 seconds. It can't handle a lot of information, but it can do a lot of deep thinking and processing. Your long-term memory, on the other hand, is where you store most of your prior knowledge and your short-term memory works in tandem with your long-term memory to figure stuff out. Oh no, a bear. My long-term memory is familiar that a bear is dangerous, and my short-term memory is going to go, you're going to need to leave your room right now, then go somewhere safer. So when we're teaching, we want to start by engaging students. We want to start with attention, right? How do we capture their attention? And this can be a very challenging piece of teaching. Management and phenomena and everything that you do in terms of starting is getting students to pay attention. From there, you have to get them to think. And sometimes we focus on this, but often this is a really challenging thing too as well. How do we get them to engage meaningfully with some information that's going to help them actually learn and maintain stuff? The last thing on here that's really important is that once we have something learned, that our brain structure has changed and we have a new connection or piece of information, we also have to be able to retrieve that information. So I often think about this in the context of student names because I'm getting old enough now that I start to forget student information. So when it's a student who had me in 10th grade and I see them as a 12th grader, I often can't retrieve their name. Now, I actually know it. If I go look at a list of 100 names, I can tell you exactly which one it is, but I can't get that information from my brain directly. I need another source to kind of help me with it. And it turns out that doing that retrieval is a really critical piece of how learning works, and that the more we practice this, the better. And this is something that's tricky because in education, if we have 20 to 30 students or even more in our classrooms, it's hard to give students the opportunity to do retrieval because sometimes that takes more time and they're doing it on an individual basis. So for me to listen to students retrieve information takes more time. So these are some of the books that I've read of cognitive science over the last couple of years, and I'm going to talk about them at the very end of this, and we'll probably take some questions on them as well. But if you're looking for recommendations, that's coming. But these are the big ideas that we've seen in cognitive science. Our perception of learning is usually wrong. So when a student feels like they're learning and they feel like they're doing a good job, they're usually not. And when a student feels confused and frustrated, often that's when they're doing the best learning that they can do. And in particular for study habits, we have students that are all over the place. So if you ask a student what they do when they study, their number one response tends to be, well, I read my notes again and again. And what reading your notes again and again doesn't do is it doesn't utilize retrieval. It doesn't test the student on whether they actually have the ideas within their brain. Instead, it allows them to become very familiar with the reading, and then they start to feel comfortable, like they understand it. And then they walk in to take a test and they realize, oh no, this is slightly different and I don't know how to bridge this gap. And they panic and they get anxious and they do poorly. Now, a good example of studying would be quizzing yourself. I'm going to try doing a problem from memory. I'm going to try and write down everything that I know, but you're using your memory to do it. That's harder. So that student is more likely to struggle and to feel worse. But when they show up to take the test, they do much better. And their anxiety actually is lower once they're actually in that test. So this is a really important thing for teaching that I don't feel like we have enough publicity of. That people's understanding that your perception is an ineffective measure. And that goes for teaching as well. You'll notice that earlier I had said in the reflection, sometimes I feel like I did a great job, but when I actually total up, what did I get done and how did my students do this week? It's not that great. Whereas in other weeks, I might be exhausted, but I might have done a really good job teaching. Retrieval and spacing are two really big components of cognitive science. Retrieving information directly from your brain is an incredibly powerful way of learning. And then spacing out. By spacing, what we mean is this. When you learn something, your brain immediately starts to forget it as soon as you stop thinking about it. And if you start to forget, your brain structure starts to revert because your brain doesn't want to remember everything that you ever learned. You don't need to know where you parked your car 10 years ago. You just need to know where you parked your car today. So the 10-year ago thing is going to disappear from memory eventually. But if you start to do the same thing over and over again, your brain goes, aha, I need to remember this. And so if you learn something, forget it, and relearn it, then your brain starts to value that information more and it locks in that structural change in a better, more effective manner. And these are two really simple things that can be added into any mode of teaching. I do modeling instruction, and we use these all the time. But if you did a traditional form of teaching, or if you taught elementary school or wherever you're doing, this will work. And this can easily jump into your classroom tomorrow. The other things on here are a little more nuanced, and so we might not get fully into all of these today, but concrete details, things that you can sense, our brains have an easier time with than abstract things. So if you're teaching math and you're doing all with variables, not that you can't do that, but just know that our brains are not designed for that. And so if we can supplement that with concrete details in a way that's effective and highlights the learning, that's helpful for students. And then the fifth one here, memory is the residue of thought, is a quote from Daniel Willingham. And basically he's saying, whatever we think about is what we remember. And so when you're doing a lesson, you might have a really creative, engaging lesson, but if it doesn't center the actual thinking and learning you want, the kids are going to remember something else. So an example given was in history, you might have the kids prepare a historical recipe of food. What the kids are going to remember is making the food. They're not going to remember the history lesson. And so it's really critical that as teachers, we spend our creativity making sure that our creative lessons are aligned with the content. I also would point out there are many neuromyths. I think something like 90 to 98% of teachers believe in learning styles, visual, kinesthetic, olfactory is a joke we make, but there's no such thing as a visual learner. There's never been any evidence to support that. There's VARC testing. That's 100% a fraud. There's no such thing as a good or bad multitasker. There's a lot of myths on that. And the last thing on here is a little important, cognitive load theory. This is about your short-term memory. Cognitive load theory says that basically your short-term memory is easily overloaded if you get too many things at once. So teaching is often, in my opinion, the aim at trying to get something really difficult across to a student that's very focused so that it's not too many things. So for me in chemistry, I can't use high-level vocabulary and complicated math and a chemistry concept altogether. No student will be able to do that. But what I can do is I can limit my choice of words to something really simple. I can limit my mathematics to really simple things, and I can highlight a really complicated chemistry concept. And then once the concept is secure in the long-term memory, then I can go back and add a terminology to it and add in that vocab piece. But I can't do all three together. So that's what you'll find if you look up what cognitive science. For me, what I found in actually teaching is that if you have students talk a lot in class, that's a good thing if they feel listened to. And emotionally, feeling listened to is one of the most valuable things for a person to feel. Sometimes you even get people who are really upset, and just by letting them voice what happened and being able to communicate why they're upset can be really valuable for that person to feel connected with someone else and to be able to be engaged in a way that they can learn and kind of come back. One of the things I actually remember from Gary was that we talked about how if a child is upset and they start to use their amygdala, that they can't process information in the prefrontal cortex. But if you ask a child a question while they're upset, and it's a yes or no question, and they respond with a yes, it will redirect their thinking to the prefrontal cortex. And I'm sure you can envision a small child who's having a tantrum and saying, would it help if we did this? And they say yes, that they calm down and they redirect their focus. Students will work better and work harder if your grading system is based on learning and not based on behavior. I have a book recommendation we'll talk about for this. Good questions are critical. Teaching, when you get into teaching for a long time and you have a repertoire of good questions, it's really helpful. Let your students do some of the exploring on their own. Let them use their long-term memories and their prior knowledge. They have that for a reason, and we want them to test that out. We want them to retrieve that information. And I think sometimes we've gotten in the habit of kind of really catering to students and letting them kind of get away with stuff that they can do on their own. I'm going to skip over a couple of these a little bit and kind of move on, because I think I want to spend some time doing something else, if that's okay. I think I'm in charge of my thing. I do want to put a couple warnings up. There are a lot of junk out there about cognitive science. Teaching is very complicated, and I'm very skeptical of anyone who's just like, well, if you just do blah, blah, blah in cognitive load theory. I always get a little like, well, are you actually a teacher? Like, do you really know this? So be careful of that. But I do recommend that you spend some time learning and processing about this. And I wanted to start with this. So here are 3 scenarios that have actually happened in my teaching career, believe it or not. First one is I ask the students to work on naming chemical formulas. Everyone is working. One student puts their head down. They're frustrated. They're sad. I come up to the student and they turn to me and they have this forlorn look in their face and they say, I have no idea what I'm doing. What should I, as the teacher, do? So in terms of brain science, what's going on with the student? What's going on with me? And how do I respond? And I don't want you to type into the chat, but if you can just process in your head as we go through these, what would you do? What would you do for this student? And is that the right thing to do? Like, what would our evidence or kind of claim be for why? Second scenario. So you can translate this into any content area, but we've been doing a circle discussion. It's a complicated question. We're trying to debate whether a chemical that formed is copper or rust. They both look orange. And a third student gives the most brilliant explanation of everything that you were hoping they would eventually learn in such a powerful way, and just absolutely brilliant explanation. We're all in a circle. I'm sitting there. I have my notebook out. What do I do? So you just heard the student say the answer of a lifetime. You're gonna write about it in your online diary later and be like, it finally happened. What should you do right at that moment? Third scenario, I have a quiz on Thursday. It is 4 points. There's literally mathematically 0 points for their final grade at some level. 8 of my students skip class to get an extra study day. 4 of them try and determine the exact content on the quiz from students who did take it, so that when they come in on Friday, they know what the quiz answers are. What should I do? Scenarios like this are so common in teaching, right? Like, we've all been in a scenario where you stop and you pause and you're like, what is the appropriate thing to do? And for those of you who are new, it's really taxing on your brain to have to make decisions. There's a decision fatigue in teaching. And I think people who track how many decisions a teacher make, it's overwhelming. But at the same token, eventually we get to a point where, for me, I know what I'm going to respond to the student by doing, right? Some teachers are going to go start with what you know, and they're going to encourage the student to kind of work through it. Some teachers are going to show them how to do it. Some teachers, it depends on what the student's current grade level is. I might look at that student and be like, maybe the problem isn't chemistry today. Maybe something else is going on, right? But at the end of the day, eventually we get to a point where we have a set number of responses so that I don't have to make that decision anymore. For this student, I remember I specifically said, I paused to let thinking happen. And then I said, oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't paying attention. What did Sarah just say? And I had someone repeat what Sarah said. And then I did that again. I said, oh, hang on. I lost my train of thought again. I'm sorry. Was someone else tell me? And I had them repeat what the student had said in their own words because I wanted to emphasize that really powerful content. This scenario, I changed my grading system. I started to make quizzes automatically reassess on the test. And I stopped having kids skip for quizzes, which was driving me bananas. But one thing I think that's important is that as you get experienced in teaching, eventually you get to a point where you do that automatically. And at some point you want to reflect and revisit, because if you don't, there's a bias susceptibility. You might make a wrong decision. You might make a decision that's not optimal. I don't know if wrong is the right word. That might be a little harsh, but eventually you do want to do some reflection on that. And I think that's really important that we track what it is that we think we're doing and why. And because we're so isolated as teachers, I think it's important to be able to find a system that you are able to do that helps you do that. All right, I am at 1:30. I wanted to share a couple things real quick, and I assume that's going to be okay. These are some videos on thinking and learning that you can share with students. I'm a big fan of Veritasium. This is a video showing System 1 and System 2. It's super helpful for students. This is a video about when students watch YouTube videos, how it's ineffective and why, and how to make it effective. And this is super good for kids in science and math and all kinds of subject areas. And it applies not just to videos. And then for younger students, this is a thing called the Learning Pit. And it's one of those things where they sketch as they talk. And it's absolutely brilliant on teaching kids how to value thinking and how to value cognition. I really like this. I show this to high school kids too, but like it would work really well with like a 3rd grade class or 1st grade class or something like that. All right. So if I can give a couple quick minutes of books, and that will hopefully guide us to certain questions here. The 2 most popular books on cognitive science are Why Don't Students Like School by Daniel Willingham and Make It Stick by Peter Brown and a couple of others. These are, if you've never read a book on this, they're absolutely fantastic. The Make It Stick is a little bit more informal. Why Don't Students Like School is slightly more formal and slightly more education focused. This is kind of how learning works in general. This is why this is focused on education and teaching. These 2 books draw from the inspiration of Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And this was the original cognitive science book. Or maybe I'm wrong on that, in my head at least. This is from the 1980s, Nobel Prize. Behave is a updated version on it. So if you get into this and you want to read an 800-page book on how we make decisions and do thinking and learning, this was awesome. Imordino Yang's book on emotion is very good about defining what emotion is and isn't and how it impacts learning. And truly, like how a student emotionally engages with what they do at school. When you give a student a problem and they do it, why did they do that? Like that answer has a huge bearing on how successful that student's going to be. What else? Inner Game of Tennis is about sports and cognitive science, how to coach. And I would tell you that the funding of sports far outpaces the funding of education in a lot of ways. And we should look to sports to learn how we can get students to learn optimally. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in here. The Learning Scientists down here have a ton of free resources. This is their book. And then Stereotype Threat is a book by Claude Steele. He's a Stanford professor, I believe. And he writes about how stereotype threat works, which is a nuanced application of cognitive science that has a lot of applications within the classroom. It's a really interesting topic, and I would encourage you to look at that. These are some other ones. This one right here is a really good one for math that we talked about at lunch if you were in my group. These are 2 math professors, and they do a good job of developing a really high-level mathematical thing. This is one on art, and I was amazed by this because I would have called myself a bad artist, even though I know that it's a practice issue and not a talent thing. But I would draw like a 4-year-old, and this was how to not do that, how to draw what you see. And it works. Like I did it. Like no one on this Zoom was worse at me than drawing. And by the end, I was drawing pictures that looked like an actual thing, even though I didn't do the full program. Ellen Langer talks about mindfulness. And I know that's in a lot of social emotional learning right now, but how this actually applies towards learning is really, really cool. I really liked her book. And then Grading for Equity. This is the best book on grading that I've ever read. And so I kind of mentioned that grading is really important, but this is a really powerful book for Where did I go? I hid my controls, so now I can't get out of here. There we go. Thank you. But this is a really powerful book on how to do grading and why, and the chance to reflect on what some of the things you do without even realizing it about grading. So I've really enjoyed that. All right, and I'm going to pause there, and I would love to hear some questions. I have not looked at the chat, so I'm going to see if I can bump that up. All right, let's see.
Well, Scott, let's first acknowledge all the awesomeness that you just shared with us. Thank you so much for just really walking us through some underpinnings of how teaching and learning happens, and really some of the brain science that both our students are experiencing in our classrooms, but also we as adults are experiencing too in our everyday lives and in our personal and professional identities. Yeah, this is some important stuff. And if you took anything away from Scott's talk today, take away the things that he shared and said, like this, and this. There was a lot of stuff, as he mentioned, but he did highlight a few things. Those would be those things to really catch on to. So if, as we've been doing all day, we want to try to invite you to share one thing that you specifically liked or learned from Scott's talk in the chat window. And then if you have a question that you'd like to ask, you can use the reaction button to raise your hand, or you can ask your question in the chat. We did put a few of the video links as Scott was sharing them in the chat window as well. So you can grab those videos and check them out later on. They are all very good. And Scott, would you say that those videos would be appropriate to share with certain age groups of learners as well?
I think so. I don't, I work with high school students. So if you teach elementary, perhaps I would double check that. But like a first grade might be a little young for some of the thinking stuff. But I think that James Nottingham one in particular would be worthwhile for any age level. But for high school one, that's a big one. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I got to think about what was the main thing I wanted to say. I honestly would say for me, a big thing is make sure that you enjoy your job. Like make sure that you dedicate the time needed to set up good systems, that you're not constantly frustrated by grading and behaviors, but like that you put in the time to kind of perfect your craft to the point you can get to that point. And then learn how learning works. Those were the two things I was trying to communicate. I love saying that the perception is ineffective. That's such a powerful tool. And once you see that, a lot of what you see in education, you kind of, I always felt like as a teacher, I always felt lazy. Like I felt like my discipline procedures were lazy. I felt like my lesson preparation was lazy. And as I learned more about how the brain works, I was like, oh no, I'm not lazy per se. At least it was some things. But rather, like I had this sense of how learning worked. And now that I have the kind of science to back it up, all of a sudden I was like, oh no, I was right. I was doing, I think sometimes teachers need that language to kind of defend some of your practices and go, no, I'm doing this intentionally. Like I know this works. It's hard to explain why. That kind of science piece really adds the why to why things work.
That's awesome. We did have a question that came up a little bit earlier. It was, how
Yep.
do you, or when do you set aside time for reading? You've got all these great books that you've recommended that you've read, and with the busy life that you live, how do you find time for reading?
Yeah. So my goal for the last 3 years has been to read 52 books per year, so one per week, and I start that in June when we get to summer. But yeah, well, one, I do a couple things that help me. So I put some peer pressure on myself. I post a poster outside my room, which was on the PowerPoint slide. And every time I read a new book, I put the cover up. And if people are going to walk by and see what you read, you're more apt to want to share that you've read a new book. I also post books I read on Twitter, and I keep a little hashtag, and then I kind of write some of my thoughts about them. And I share what I read with my students frequently. So those all encourage me to read. How I find time to do it, actually, I find reading really nice to get me off of like a phone or off of a screen. I feel like in my work, I'm very busy, but a lot of my work is on the computer. And so when I'm done with that, I want to go do something that's not a screen. And so I'll grab a book to read. I also set goals for how much I read. So in my weekly reflections, if I haven't read a lot the last week, like this week, I did not read much. I'll set a goal for next week to read a certain number of pages. And that, just setting that and then knowing I'll check it at the end of the week, motivates me to do it. And then the last thing I do is I keep a to-do list every day and every week. And I kind of put in there, okay, today I want to exercise, I want to read, and that means I'm not writing today. So tomorrow I'm going to write. And I kind of track day to day, here are the things I want to do. And that makes me kind of come through in the morning and go, what's something I can do to kind of do something? Well, I could read real quick, and so I'll go read for 30 minutes or something like that. But honestly, just the more I read, I love reading. Right now, I'm reading a book called Conversations on Chemistry. It's by Jane Marcet. So she was born in like 1760 something, and she was a female chemistry teacher. And I don't remember for sure, but it might have been illegal for her to teach because women were not allowed to do certain things, or I shouldn't say that in a passive. Women were restricted from doing certain things. And this book, when she first published it, she published it anonymously. This is the book that inspired Michael Faraday to go into physics and chemistry. And it's a female teacher teaching two female students, and the students ask her questions and explain things to her, and then she clarifies things, and it's fascinating. So I love reading that, and it's super fun. So yeah, audiobooks, I haven't gotten into those. I like podcasts, but yeah, I think like I have a very short commute, but I do try and do things productive, like when I go to pick up my kids, and I try and look for like, what's 10 minutes that I can use that I want to get something done in. So
You notice, is there a significant difference or a difference at all in terms of like the learning experience of reading versus listening to a book for those who might be wondering, like, you read a lot of great content. If I listened to all of those books, would I also be able to learn great stuff as well? Or would it be something different? Like, is that experience from a cognitive science standpoint much different?
oh, you mean like once I know how cognitive science works, do I read a book and get more out of it because of that?
No, not necessarily, but like from your knowledge of cognitive science, is there anything to suggest that listening to a book versus actually reading it
Yeah,
has
I
an
think
impact on your learning of what's in that book?
Yeah, I think that the multitasking, I mean, when you're driving a car, your brain is working. You might not notice it, but like it's doing a lot of processing and you're used to it. But like I think I retain a lot less when I listen in the car than when I just sit quietly and read. Like removing distractions is key, and you really need to focus when you drive. And so your brain is kind of switching between the two. The study that they often talk about is if you say A through Z as fast as you can, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, and Z. And then you count 1 to 26 as fast as you can, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, like that. And then you try and do alternating, A1, B2, C3, D4. Like no matter how fast you think you can do it, you're going to be slower switching between the groups than you will if you're just doing a single task. And so when you're driving, you're constantly processing information. And so listening to a thing, your brain is flipping between the two rapidly. And so you're not able to process as much from an audiobook. Now, if you're the passenger, that's probably a little different, right, than if you're actually engaged in driving. But even then, you're probably dealing with some distractions. So that would be my guess.
That's a great response there. We appreciate that. I think we have about time for one more question here in the big group. If anyone would like to unmute and speak directly their question to Scott, you have a chance to do that right now before we head into our breakout rooms coming up.
Can I ask my question, Gary? This is Joe.
Sure thing, go right ahead.
Okay. Well, this is man, Scott, thanks so much for sharing, man. I first of all, I love your voice. I mentioned that in the chat. I'm a chat guy, in case other people haven't noticed that. I just love being involved in the chat. But so if I've said this in the chat, if I read something great, or I see some like great advice about something, even like workflow type stuff on like Instagram, I might want to like share it right away. If I like post some, I'd want to like post it, share it. Can you say what happens? Because I know that that's not a great way to like retain information when you're just like, oh my gosh, that's so good, I have to share it with the world. But it's super common. Like I know it's not just a me thing. Like my students I like mentor, like they're constantly seeing and sharing advice. And I would love to know how to talk to them about what's happening cognitively and how to like just hold on to stuff before you share it.
Not sure if I understand your question, but like the first thought I have hearing it is if you're saying like, okay, I see something and I'm like, ah, yes, that connects to me and I love it, and then I want to go share it. How do I retain it? Like, because we forget that we did it. So I mean, like, if you're popular on the social media, you're gonna get notifications that kind of crop up. But really, like a lot of what that's about is that you need to kind of have a space to forget it and then come back and relearn it, right? Like you need it to stick. And in order to stick, you're going to have to go through that cycle. And so you need some kind of mechanism to save it somewhere else that you're going to revisit later. Actually, the to-do list I do and the reflections I do of having a weekly thing and going, oh yeah, I did this new lesson style this week. And I'd even forgotten about it until I went to do my reflection. But now that I did it and I lock it in there, and I even have a separate reflection that I don't share publicly, where I go through and I go, okay, for my chemistry class, and I'll put a little note on that unit so that the next year when I go to that unit, I can go, I had a really interesting thought about this, and I can even save a tweet, or I don't have Instagram, sorry, I'm not as cool, but I'm on Twitter, but I'll save that tweet and then go, okay, so I could share this with my students to get them to think and process about something. So you kind of need, and there's so many ways to do that now, like Google Calendar, and like I just keep a Google Doc and running of like all the things that I want. But ways like that, I mean, like I had said earlier, when I read a book and I share it with my students the next day, that right there is that spacing and allows me to kind of retain it. And other things you can do is listening to others hear like what it is you're going for. So when a student goes, all right, so tell me what you think about this thing that I read. Like I learned this in history and I had always thought this, but then I came to find out like, wow, I really didn't know history well. Like that's crazy. Helen Keller was all these things. And I just thought after 20, she disappeared, like, and then the kids are like, yeah, we thought that too. Like, why weren't we taught about all this other stuff that happened? And you get a conversation going where you can kind of like, you got a social component to it. That's really powerful because we remember stories really well, and we remember events and interactions really, really well, especially like, a teacher student, there's an emotional bond between them that allows kind of for a really, really emotionally attached connection for content or whatever else. So, all right, what did that even come close?
It was good. It was good. I know that my question was kind of like out there, but you had me thinking about so many things during your presentation. I loved it. Thank you.
Welcome. Well, I forgot to do it, but at some point I was going to do this so you could see that, like, your brain is always paying attention, but also transitions, you got to keep the kids on their toes. So that's oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just gonna ask, can you explain what you're doing? I see a lighter and I want to know what you're doing.
This is a flash cotton. So it's cotton that's been soaked in nitric and sulfuric acid. You can buy this, and it's such a powerful thing for teachers. So let's say you get little things like this. So it has so much oxygen embedded in the structure that when you burn it, it burns both really rapidly, 1, 2, 3. And
I love that.
it's gone. Like it's not gone. It's now CO2 and steam.
Well, yes, because things don't disappear.
Yes.
We just don't see them anymore. It's not destroyed.
It's called flash cotton. It's magicians use it. I probably could find a link later on Amazon, but I used to get it from magic shops like Penguin Magic and stuff like that. So it's very cool. Yeah, feel free to always get tricks on how to engage students from your chemistry teachers. We like to do dangerous stuff. That one's not dangerous, but other stuff would be.
Never. I guess my one other question, Scott, is if I could only like read one book in the next week, because you like gave me like 10 trillion books to add to my reading list, what would that one book be?
I really like Grading for Equity. I know it's kind of not cognitive science, but this one's really good. If you want to borrow this from me, you're welcome to. The one book I would recommend would probably be Make It Stick. It's a very easy read, and you'll like it. And I think it's important you like the first one that you read.
Okay, I have a copy of that from Mark. So yes,
that one's a really good one. I really like Willingham's stuff. He has some free articles posted online if you search him up. So I like his book better, I guess I would say, but I would read the other one first. I think that was the first one that I read.
Okay.
Yeah, awesome. And I wouldn't start with a technical one. I would kind of build towards that.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, this is so great just to be able to hear all these great suggestions. Someone put in the chat that, Kristen, we're going to follow up with you in a week to make sure we hold you accountable for reading the whole book. in 1 week. That's because what we learned in our presentation here. But just again, thank you so much, Scott Milam. Let's show some love to Scott. Thank you very much for sharing your time and your expertise with us. What is going to happen next here is our breakout rooms to be able to talk about and process what we just heard in Scott's talk. So let me go ahead and pause here.